Hello, hello. Welcome back. I'm Bonnie, and this is Angular Nation, and I'm very, very, very excited to be here with our guest, Alex Rickabaugh. How are you doing, Alex?
I'm doing great. It's about 8:15 in the morning here in California. So hello, hello.
Thank you so
Got my
much
coffee,
for
ready to go.
yeah. Let me see your coffee cup. You have big news.
Yeah, so my sister recently had her first baby, and I got to go home for Christmas and actually meet him for the first time, which is not the easiest thing to do in a pandemic, especially for such a young kid. But yeah, he's amazing. We call him the drool monster. Sorry, Gus, if
So
you
you
ever watch
like
this
him?
video. Yes, yeah. Oh, he is. My sister was not the world's chillest baby. She cried a lot growing up. My parents have actually said that if she came first, I probably wouldn't be here.
Wow.
She gave them a lot of trouble, and so everyone was kind of waiting to see what kind of kid she would have. But this kid is just the calmest, doesn't cry, like just the sweetest child you can imagine.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're here in the in Angular Nation, and we have some of my favorite people from this community. We have some really cool people, and I just love hanging out with you. But I really want to let you hang out with my friends and get to know them, and they have some questions for you. And we also have, because there are some really cool things that you're working on the Angular team, and that's why I just love having you stop by as often as you can, because it's just always a fascinating conversation to see kind of what's going on behind the scenes. I love it. Okay, so who wants to start us off? I know Aristides has questions. I know Ankita has questions.
Let's start with Ankita.
Okay, mine is a very basic question, and it's probably me just missing out on something. And if I could just share the tab to talk about the Angular coding style guide that I'm talking about.
Okay.
So it says here that we should prefer host binding over host metadata, and it has this example. And I understand this example, and I agree that it makes sense for a directive. But for if I were to use host to assign a class for a component, I think host binding is an overkill for doing that. But because this is in the style guide that don't use host, it shows as a warning in
Right.
when you have ESLint, and that just throws me off.
So your question is basically like, should you follow the style guide here, or what's the reason for recommending one versus the other?
Yeah, like why would I not? Why can't I use host for a class just to like give the component a class name? Or should I not be doing that?
This is an interesting one, because I think there are people on the Angular team who have dramatically opposite views on this. So I think it's like Jeremy from used to be the components TL. Now he's kind of like the Uber Angular TL. If I remember right, he very much prefers the host attribute on the @directive compared to host binding and host listener decorator, annotations. And I think we're one of the things we're talking about doing is going and updating the Angular style guide. It's been quite a while since that was written, and best practices have changed in certain areas. This is probably one of those things that you'll see revised.
Okay.
So I would say if you prefer the host attribute to the decorators, feel free to do that.
Okay.
Go ahead and silence the warning, because it's not going to make that much of a difference.
Okay, yeah, I just very strongly stick to the style guide, except for when I find something that doesn't make sense. I'm like, what am I missing? Obviously, I'm the one who's wrong, but it's good to know I'm not. Thank you.
Yeah, no trouble.
Good
that
question.
was my question.
That was a good question. Aristides.
Yeah, actually, I think that my question is specific to the compiler.
Okay.
Suppose that we have a shared module somewhere that contains a pipe. So in one of my feature modules, I want to use this pipe. So the shared module exports the pipe, and then I
Right.
go to my template. I import the shared module inside my module, and then I go to my template and use the pipe. Now, if I want to use the pipe in my component class, I need to add it to the provider's property of the component decorator.
Oh, so use the pipe as a service kind of thing.
That's right. And
Yeah.
I was wondering, why do I need this? Because the pipe is already exported from the module. Since I import the module, why do I need to provide it inside my component separately?
Yeah. So man, this is such a good question. So the dependency injection world, right, of what services can I inject and how are they created, is different in Angular from the component template world of like what's available to match in a template by selector or by pipe name. So the reason is because those things are configured differently. You have to provide the configuration kind of twice if you want to use it in both contexts. And there is a little bit of subtlety there because there is like dependency injection works a little bit, just tiniest little bit differently when we're creating something inside of a component template versus when we're creating it to be injected as a service into a component constructor. There's some subtleties around like which change detector references do you get and things like that. So the technical reason is kind of like not only is DI for injection into a component in a separate world from what matches in a template, but you actually have to explicitly tell Angular that it's okay to construct this thing in a non-template context. And so that's what providing it explicitly does.
Right. Thanks. And
so the reason I said it's such a good question is one of the conversations we're having right now in the design of standalone components and the kind of planning for what comes after the initial feature. So we're expecting in the next 3 to 6 months, assuming everything goes well, to roll out the initial version of standalone components. And that means the compiler will support compiling a standalone component. Certain APIs will integrate with it. So view container ref create component will do the right thing when you give it a standalone component. Maybe the router knows how to lazy load them in a certain way, things like that. But after that, we're going to look at kind of the real motivation behind standalone components, which is making ng modules simpler. And at the heart of this issue is the confusion between configuring dependency injection and making sure dependency injection is set up right, and configuring component templates. So right now, Angular's users kind of don't have to think too much about this because ng modules paper over this distinction. But it will be very clear in the future that like importing your shared module to get access to the pipe in your template is a different kind of configuration than setting up that pipe to be provided as a service across your whole application. And the fact that you can do both things in the shared module, I think is doing a disservice to users. We're conflating two concepts that really have different life cycles and different implications.
Is it the same injector? Do we use the same injector instance in both ways, or is it different instance?
So the matching of components, directives, pipes, inputs has nothing to do with dependency injection. Okay. The compiler is doing that. It's looking at the ng module. It's looking at what the template for the component looks like, and it actually builds a kind of list of these are the things which the ng module says are allowed to be in here, right? Which might match. And then it goes through all the nodes in the template and says, okay, this directive, applies to this element because it matches this attribute with its selector. So we need to include this directive in the component. They're using the pipe called async. We found an async pipe as part of common module that's imported. So that matches up. So all of this is resolved at compile time, and dependency injection is only really a runtime concept. So when your code comes out of the compiler and goes to the browser, we've listed there like these certain directives are used in the template, this pipe is used in the template, but actually constructing those things then relies on the runtime dependency injection.
That's very clear. Thanks.
Yeah. So just because your pipe matches in the template does not mean Angular necessarily knows how to, or knows that it should allow you to construct it and inject it as a normal service. Sander,
Excellent
sir.
question. Sander.
Yeah, I've actually a couple of questions, and they are not related to what we're talking about. If I'm looking at the framework landscape at large, I'm seeing a movement towards edge computing more and more.
Edge computing, okay.
That basically means that I actually would like to run the platform server on an edge function.
Right.
Define edge for the rest of us, will you?
Cloudflare, workers, things like that, where you basically have a server-side function, but it is not on the server; it's on the outer edges of the network.
All right.
It's a little bit different, and that's where we are going, and that's where we can speed things really up. And in the
So I've heard this described through analogy as, imagine if you needed to get gas in your car and you had to drive all the way to the coast in Texas to go to the oil refinery to actually fill up your tank, right? That seems like quite a burden. But this is actually the model we have now with client-server architecture, right? The browser needs to get data, and it goes all the way to the data center where the server is running in order to do that. So what edge computing does is says, okay, your internet service provider has an office locally in your town. They can put a server in there that acts as kind of an intermediary. And some of the times, the request that you make only needs to go as far as, down the block from you, or, to the local data center at the end of your internet connection to answer that request and come back. So it's like, being able to go to your local service center and fill up with gas instead of actually having to drive all the way down to the refinery.
That is actually a good analogy for this.
Yeah.
Yes, that
love your
totally makes
analogies.
sense.
He's got a squirrel analogy too. It's a good one.
Yeah.
Oh,
We'll come to that later.
And in relation with that, is Angular going to be a little bit more friendly to rehydration, or not doing that?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think the only thing I can say about this is keep your eye on the Angular I/O roadmap this year.
Yeah, I'm working on this for myself in Scully.
Yeah.
So perhaps we should sit together once, because this is a big breaking point, and if we can handle this correctly,
Yes.
Angular becomes so much more useful, especially if I get going what I want going in this edge functions with the platform work.
Yeah. The initial implementation of server-side rendering for Angular was really an MVP, right? It was this concept of when you bootstrap on the client, let's just tear down this DOM that the server built. And for people who don't necessarily dig into the internals of Angular server-side rendering on a regular basis, the way it actually works is when you render the application on the server, you send down a bunch of HTML representing the page that was rendered. And it kind of looks like, so what that looks like in DOM is you have your application component selector, right? Your app root or app component or whatever you call it. And inside that tag is the rest of the rendered application, just like it would look on the client. And what happens in the browser is that gets displayed. But when Angular bootstraps the application on the client, it finds that application root tag and says, okay, I need to put my app component here. And it deletes everything inside of it. So it completely throws away all of the work that was done to server-side render the application and re-renders on the client as if it wasn't server-side rendered. And hopefully, if your application is consistent, you get the same DOM back. And then because this happens kind of synchronously in the browser, the user doesn't actually notice. So we kind of delete the DOM that's there and replace it with identical DOM, and this happens synchronously, and the UI does not change. The problem is that there are lots of ways that users can end up noticing this. One, it takes a while, but two, like suppose you clicked onto an input, like a text input, and we're typing. If we delete that text input and replace it, sure, the input looks the same, but the content that you put in there is gone. Another problem that happens is like if you click any buttons, right?
We have a Scully plugin that solves that problem though, but yeah.
You do like event replay and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's cumbersome.
But in a naive like server-side rendered application with Angular, if you click a button before that client is able to come alive and replace the page with its DOM, there's no actual click listener registered. So the click is kind of dropped into the ether. So this was kind of the like basic version of server-side rendering, and functionality that many other frameworks have for server-side rendering. There's a typical approach of doing this called hydration, and the idea is instead of deleting and replacing the page, you actually kind of render over top of the existing HTML. And you're able to kind of reconcile what DOM the client wants to be there with what DOM is already there present from the server. And so instead of replacing the application, you are hydrating it. You're like taking the client behavior that's described by your components and attaching it to the DOM that was already there. Agent RR.
Yeah, I raised my hand because I didn't want to be skipped again.
Yeah, go for it.
No, it was there was an interesting question about ng end-to-end. So build, if there's any way that we can skip it, because I was researching in regards to the question, if we can skip the build, if we already have it built, and why do we need to rebuild if we already built it to begin with? So I know that ng no serve, which was skipping the compile, is no longer available, right, as an option on the ng E2E. So is there another way that we can maybe skip the build if you already built it?
I don't necessarily know, because I don't work on the kind of CLI side very often. I know that the reason you have to do the build, right, is the Angular CLI is not a is not like a true build system where it has some understanding of which things can be reused and which things need to rebuild given a set of changes. So if you've ever worked with a system like Bazel, or even like the old school like Makefiles, there's some concept of like these inputs have changed, therefore these actions need to happen to update the state of the final build. The Angular CLI does not know how to do that. So when you say ng end-to-end, it knows that there's an existing build there, but it has no idea if that build is like still valid, if you've changed anything on the file system that would require, kind of redoing that work. And so it kind of has to be pessimistic and assume that, yeah, we need to rebuild the world because we don't know if the user touched something. It doesn't know if your build was made, 5 seconds ago or 5 hours ago. So that's why the CLI is just, very naive and says, okay, let's throw out the application, rebuild everything, and get accurate results that way. I think I've not worked with NX much, but I think NX has some kind of dependency understanding that's better than Angular CLIs. So it might be able to be a little bit smarter about that.
All right, thank you. So I wasn't far off when I said that ng E2E is a build anyway, so he has to rebuild because he doesn't understand that those things that have changed or not changed. Doesn't know if the build was stale, right? So doesn't know what things have changed already. So yeah, got it. Thank you.
And I don't know if there's a flag you can pass there to tell it, like, please just trust that my build is good to go.
Yeah, before there was a no server,
Yeah.
which skipped the compile, but now that's no longer there. You can only skip files that can be, I guess, included in the build.
It
So,
might just be a limitation of like the way it's implemented in Webpack, where building the end-to-end testing bundle is like a separate Webpack thing than the actual application build. So one is not useful as caching input to the other.
Yeah, I would say the Angular cache would be able to feed this build also, because it's the same modules.
It is, but the like I think the end-to-end build is a superset of the main application build. Like you're building the app and the test together. And I think if that's done as like one Webpack action, then it's kind of treated differently as, you know, it's a different compilation with different inputs, that some of which happen to be the same.
I might have a solution for that. They can do the same thing I'm doing in Scully. And just use the, yeah. Well,
Rob, can you tag Sonder on that post that you were talking about? This was a question that someone asked on Angular Nation earlier.
The thing is, in Scully, I'm using platform server now.
Oh, not right now.
I use platform server as a renderer, and I'm having like I'm basically loading in the Angular application runtime from scratch. So that will work for end-to-end testing too. It's the same concept.
Yeah.
And you have to compile the thing, but you don't have to build it. But for end-to-end test, you might want to go with the build because there might be small differences. However, for the bulk of things, it will not make it any difference.
You saying that you're skipping the compile, or?
No, I'm skipping the build. The compile is not taking that much time. The build and the whole bundling takes more time. Right. So you can do it without that, and just use the ESM modules that are outputted by the Angular compiler and go from there.
He makes it sound
I think
so
it's
easy.
what Alex said before, that the CLI, it doesn't understand that what has changed and what has, so it requires a new build because it needs to do end-to-end testing. So in order for you to do end-to-end testing, you need to include the test as well as include everything else, which you don't know if it has changed or not. So
the thing is, the test suite is an application, and it can load the other application. If you are loading the other application, you don't need to rebuild it. You don't need to recompile it. You can just pull in what you need from there, and you can do that on the fly.
If you know that the previously built thing is the correct.
I was gonna say, I really feel like it's just setting themselves up. Like at some point, you're gonna screw that up, and it's gonna. I mean. How are you going to know that if you're using a prior version that nothing has changed other than trusting the humans, which we try to avoid? So maybe that's why that functionality is not there, because I know the Angular team like really has a lot, like they think for a long time before they decide how this stuff is going to work. So if the functionality is not there, there's probably a reason, because we would break it, because we would go back and use an old thing and all our tests would pass and we would have false confidence.
And this is probably one of the hardest things I've worked on as a career, in my career as a software developer, is the incremental build system in the Angular compiler. It is such a just challenging, nuanced problem space. And so many of the considerations that we had to do were like, well, in 99.8% of the time, like this optimization would be totally valid and we could, skip doing a whole bunch of work, right? But like if the user did this exact set of changes and then came back with an incremental build, like it would break. And the rule that we followed is the compiler always has to be correct. We don't have the luxury of ever being wrong, even in an incremental build context, because that just leads to, confusion and pain for users. If they happen to trip over one of these things.
Yeah, but there is a difference between compiling and building, though.
Yes. We had a I built this like crazy system in the compiler that would try to keep track of like when certain things could have changed, and then try to figure out like, did they actually change? And there's this whole like front-loaded set of work that the compiler would do to figure this out. And it was like we had bugs with it. It was wrong in certain cases. So you're adding more logic to try to like detect these edge cases.
And in the end, it's slower than where you started.
Yeah. And then Joost was like debugging into some of these things, and he messaged me one day. He's like, Alex, I have a prototype I'd like you to look at. And he'd ripped out this like complicated thing that I built and just put this really simple system into the compiler that solved everything. Was like, you know, a tenth the code that I had. And he had this really clever way of just like, yeah, if we let the compiler do a little bit more work, then it can know perfectly whether it should skip everything coming after that. Just brilliant. Joost is fantastic as an engineer. Just love working with him.
And he's Dutch.
Yes. Yeah, he lives quite near you, I think, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Also Utrecht.
Yeah, he's a cool guy.
Yeah. All right.
I would like also to ask something about hydration. I recently I saw today a tweet from the Quick Dev framework that the
Mishko.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Quick is very interesting.
And they showed that they had a list from which projects did they draw inspiration, and it was very interesting that one of them was Wiz.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, did you ever consider, when we were building Angular back in 2.0 version, did you ever consider it also as in respective of the hydration feature?
Interesting. I'm the wrong person to ask. So I joined the Angular team kind of around the 2.0 alpha days, just before I think it went to public alpha. And so the design was already kind of done at that point. So that would be a better question for Mishko or Igor or someone who was around back then.
I was a little bit around in that time.
I'm pretty sure Mishko would be happy to come back and talk to us about Quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing is, the whole frameworks and environments were not ready for rehydration back then. There were so many other problems that had higher priority.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the most asked questions on GitHub, of one of the most upvoted. We want rehydration that goes back to the first version of SSR, I think.
I'll spill the beans a little bit. It is in our roadmap for the year. At the very least, we're going to investigate hydration and see, like, is there a design that's compatible with the way Angular works?
That is going to be rough.
Yes.
That is going to be rough.
Some ideas there. Quick has a really interesting approach that I think is worth taking a look at.
It is worth taking a look at. I have looked at it. And it works, but I don't think it's really compatible with Angular in its current form. Perhaps we can draw something out of that if we have standalone components, because you really need to be way more granular than we are now to be able to pull this one off. Yeah, so we haven't started designing this. So all I have are kind of half-baked, like little nuggets of ideas. But the way Angular templates work in Ivy is we have a template function that has what's called the create block, and the create block calls instructions to make DOM elements. So stamp out a div, stamp out a text node, some templates and things like that. And each one of these things that gets created gets assigned an ID. And the compiler does this. So, you have element 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. And then that's so later on when we do binding and stuff, we can say like, oh, bind to element 6.
and the runtime is really, really fast at finding element 6, given that instruction. But it might be possible to encode those element IDs into the DOM that we generate on the server, such that when we execute the create block on the client, it says, oh, create element 0 as a div, and the client can know, okay, I can really quickly go in the DOM and find the element labeled element 0 and use that instead of creating a new one.
Yeah, reconnect it up.
Yeah.
To be really, really good at rehydration, you actually need to do a little bit more than Quick is doing. You need to separate the creation from the updating.
Yeah, and Ivy already has that.
Ivy has most of this already, so it should be possible. It's not going to be easy.
I agree with you there. Yeah. I'm very, very excited about getting started on this. Yeah. Probably something you'll see later in the year rather than earlier, but it is something we're looking at doing. Yeah.
Love it. Do we have any more questions? Because we do have a couple of things that Alex wanted to just give us like sneak peeks. And I think, do you have a hard stop at the top of the hour, Alex? We could keep you here all day, but I know you have work to do.
I could probably go to 15 minutes past the hour. Then I do have to jump into other calls.
All right, we won't keep you.
Actually,
any more questions
on this framework at some point?
Right. Okay. We wanted to get a quick update on, I know you're working on the standalone components that we're very excited about.
Right.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
And then we wanted to talk about, if we have to, I don't know if we'll have time, we could always talk to you about the DOM and what's going on in the DOM. But then also, I know that there was a new feature in the compiler that you wanted to give us a little sneak peek. You just pick whatever you want to share with us.
Let's go ahead and start there, actually. So we had an intern by the name of Daniel who worked with us this year and built a feature in the compiler that we called extended diagnostics or extended template diagnostics. And so I'll just give you a little bit of background. So diagnostics are what TypeScript calls the error messages that you see when you code something wrong. So diagnostic shows you like the red squiggly line in your code of what's broken, gives you an error code that tells you, like very explicitly what's going on, what needs to be fixed. And in Angular, we have template type checking, which produces template diagnostics. And the way this works is we convert your templates into TypeScript code that we feed to the compiler. The TypeScript compiler gives us errors in the TypeScript code, and we map those back to your template. So if you say in your code, like, I'm going to bind to user.name, we convert that to TypeScript code that says, like, expresses somehow, go to the component, get the user property, and try to read name off of it. And if there's an error in that, then we show you a red squiggly line in your template saying, hey, user doesn't actually have a name, right? Maybe this first name or last name or something like that. So that type check block that we generate, the TypeScript code that represents the template, is really useful because it knows the types of all of the directives. It knows the types of every binding that you have. There's a lot of information there that can be used to further check things in the template. And so Daniel built a system called Extended Template Diagnostics that allows us to implement additional checks using the information in the template type check block. And an example of this is safe property navigation. So if you do foo !.bar, that's saying if foo is null or undefined, just return null. Otherwise, read the bar property. And it's really useful when you have objects where certain fields might be optional, or where you just want to kind of carry that null or undefined through and not necessarily throw an error when that happens. Sometimes people do this when it's not necessary, right? If you say, user !.name and user is never null or undefined, you don't actually need the safe property navigation there. And so what the extended template diagnostics allowed us to do was add a check that can go in and like find these things in the template type check block and tell you like, hey, you're doing this thing, this optional navigation here. It's not actually necessary because we know the TypeScript type of user and it doesn't allow it to be null or undefined. So this extra guard that you have in there is just unnecessary. It's almost like a lint check. And so extended diagnostics are the first thing in the compiler that can actually produce warnings in addition to errors. So we can tell you like, hey, this bit of code that you wrote is correct, but it's probably either doing things that aren't necessary or it's not going to do exactly what you think it's going to do. And so this system is interesting. We have a couple of checks that it's kind of shipping with, including this unnecessary safe navigation check. There's a whole section in your TS config for Angular where you can say, I want these checks to be errors. I want these checks to be warnings. I want to turn other ones off. And so this is coming in 13.2. We just kind of landed the final configuration to turn the feature on. And in the future, it would be interesting to see if we can partner with tools in the community like Angular ESLint that James Henry works on, and other cases where people have used compiler APIs in the past to implement kind of extra checks and linting in the template, and allow them to author these checks directly in the Angular compiler. So you get them in your IDE through language service, you get them when you build, you get them on your CI. And so this is one of the cases where we're starting to think about how people can extend the Angular compiler to add their own kind of opinionated checks.
We want to see it. Do you think Daniel will come and visit us? Is he shy? Is he chill? Is he? Can we request him?
I'm sure he would be agreeable, and we can reach out to him about that. He is a university student, so he is quite busy. And he's no longer, an intern for Google, not working with the team anymore. So if he did it, it would kind of be in his free time kind of thing.
It might be fun.
Yeah.
It sounds cool. Do a little demo. Or you could do a demo for us, maybe. Next time you stop by. That would be fun. Rob.
Yeah, wondering if this extended template. So will this also make sure that the error messages are not so cryptic as they are right now? Because like sometimes you get this.
They've come a long way, like, Rob.
It's like it's really, really hard to decipher what you guys are saying there. So
Yeah. If you know of a cryptic error message in the compiler, please file an issue. I will fix it. We've been working pretty hard at standardizing how we do errors, both in the compiler and runtime. Minko and Andrew Kushner have done a lot on this recently. So we've consolidated all of the errors that Angular gives you at runtime into an enum. So we assign them standardized error codes. You can look them up in our documentation. We're trying to get to the point where we have a specific page about each error with more content on like where this error comes from, how to think about debugging it, how to fix it, what kind of common patterns and mistakes that we see. So not all of the errors have this, but some of them do. And when they do, either the runtime or the compiler tries to give you a link to that page directly in the diagnostic.
Maybe it will be a good idea if, like, when you go to that page, it gives you like a sample how to correct the error.
Yep.
And, yeah. Okay. It does.
Exactly. Some of them have videos.
Mm-hmm.
So it like actually shows you like someone walking through the process of debugging. So you can see a good example of that is on just the errors page here. These are the ones for which we have actual full error pages. And so expression change after it's checked, right? Everyone's favorite error of all kinds of Angular. This has a video, this has a description of it, shows you kind of debugging steps and things like that. We're trying to be better about errors actually coming with more context.
You're doing
so that's actually what I'm doing in standalone components right now. I'm building the implementation in the compiler, and a lot of it is of all of the things that you can do wrong with them. like importing a component that's not standalone instead of importing its module. That's something that the compiler won't let you do. And so recognizing that and giving an error message that tells the user, like, here's what you should be doing instead. That has been a fun exercise.
Do you think they would let you put silly error messages in there at all? Could there be like an Easter egg, some like obscure thing that you could put there just for us that's just goofy? We would be so happy, Alex. Not too goofy, not like unprofessional goofy, just a little silly, it's allowed. I'm just saying.
There are some funny like comments and stuff in the compiler. So I don't know if you remember in the early days of Angular, there was this confusion between Angular JS and Angular 2, right?
Oh yeah.
And Igor had this whole thing of like, it's just Angular, right? Stop saying the 2, it's just Angular. And so in the compiler, we actually have to compile Angular core specially. So every other target that we compile, every piece of an application, when we generate code, we generate runtime calls and we import them from Angular core. But you can't import things from Angular core if you are building Angular core. It has to come from a special place. So the compiler knows how to recognize when it's building the actual Angular core package. And it knows this because there's a constant in a particular file called it's just Angular equals true. And that's how it goes. And if it sees that, it's like, oh, yes, OK, I'm building Angular core. I have to be in my special mode of importing things from a certain place.
That's funny. I love the inside nerd jokes. I met a guy at a conference once that it was like, I don't know, Angular version 5 or 6 we were on. And he had a T-shirt that said, still waiting for Angular version 3. And I was just like, now that's funny. I love it. It's like nerd humor that nobody else would understand except us. And it's just it brought me joy. That guy was cool.
I see people make that joke on the issue tracker all the time. Like, oh yeah, the Angular doesn't support this. It's coming in Angular 3. Like,
maybe a cool feature would be to, when you run ngserve, each time you run ngserve, you will get an information such as, did you know that Angular did this? Or did you know that Angular has this? Like,
that's an interesting idea.
Small tip.
Yeah, like tip of the day kind of thing.
That's right.
That's cool. We like this is unrelated to Angular or anything, but I was reading an article about this kind of feature in software engineering and the industry in general. And the message was that you have to be careful about doing things like this. Those little fun messages, or like it talk like a pirate day, like your CLI uses pirate language instead of normal language. Like some of Google's internal tools actually do this. So they'll show a different progress bar on certain days of the year, with different colors or things like that. But it had examples of cases where people had filed bugs because their tools broke in CI on a certain day of the year because the tool printed different output, and they were asserting that the output was matched some pattern. So it's fun to be playful like that, but you actually have you're building things that people's livelihoods depend on, and so you have to be careful not to incidentally like cause them undue pain while you're trying to have fun.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But
every once in a while you just slip a dope in. What's that, Rob?
No, I'm just saying that couldn't we just pull it from the network? If you connect it to the network, just pull the message, like just one time. Don't do it. Don't continue to keep on doing the same thing, of pulling the message. So.
Yeah, and if there are ways things are being run interactively rather than like on a script or something, maybe you can do checks there. It's just something to put a little bit of thought into and not just like do on a whim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it. This is so fun. Okay, we are almost out of time. Any final questions? If not, I'm going to turn it back over to Alex. Alex, any final thoughts? Anything you're looking forward to? Anything that you're stuck on right now, or anything you want to share?
I I want to share excitement generally. I am so excited for the roadmap that we have this year on the team. Doing things like standalone components, doing things like, strictly typed forms. We are, we've been working internally on kind of finishing up the Ivy migration in Google 3, getting the last of Google's apps onto Ivy. And it's so exciting to be able to kind of close the door on that. We've deleted View Engine from the code base. That alone has allowed us to start making some really nice optimizations. So you see now, like we talked about the like DOM module that you were putting together, and create component, and like component factor resolver and ng factory. Those APIs are finally here. You can view container ref, create component, give it a component. Don't worry about component factor resolver. It'll work great. It's just nice to actually be able to finally address some of these problems.
It's such a good time to be an Angular developer. Okay,
Yeah.
One last question. Oh wait, Mateo has a question. Okay, don't let me forget. I have one last question.
Yeah, a final note, because I just finished the upgrade to Angular 12 of the 20 websites of our company. And I'm super happy because I saw the CI reducing execution times like 30%. So it's just about Ivy, and I love it. Like I'm looking forward for the latest version and all the optimizations. So thank you, Alex.
Yeah,
Wasn't even a
thank you.
question. He's just excited with us. We're all excited.
Yeah.
So much exciting stuff going on. Okay. Speaking of exciting, one last question. This one should, I don't know, it might actually be a hard question. Okay, so because first of all, the last time we saw you asked if you could bring Dylan, and I was like, yeah, sure, bring. And then he turned out to be really cool. We love Dylan, so we would like you to say hello to Dylan for us, and we would like Dylan to come back and update us on the typed forms. We're excited about that. Next month, I believe we have Jessica Janet coming. I'm very excited about that.
Fantastic.
Yes. And I just talked to her briefly in passing, but she said she actually has something cool that she's working on that she could show us. So I don't even know what it is. I just love Jessica. So she's going to be here. So my question, yes, Connie with the sword. Yes, exactly. And we're going to maybe see if we can get an update on her R2D2 situation. Did you know, Alex, Jessica now has a 3D printer too?
Yes.
Have you guys
yeah, we've nerded out about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so here's my question. Is there anyone else that we don't, I love Pete, right? Is there anyone else that you really love that we have not met yet on the Angular team that you feel like is like an undiscovered gem?
Oh gosh. You've with Dylan and Jess, right? And I don't know if we had Andrew Scott on here before?
No.
We should probably do that.
Is he cool?
He's very cool. One of the framework folks, and he's been working on Angular for a few years now. He kind of owns and takes care of the Angular router. So he's working
I think the router is really unappreciated. There are a lot of people that are not utilizing the router at all.
It is also probably one of the hardest pieces of Angular code to maintain, because so many applications have very specific needs related to routing, and they find really creative ways of achieving this within the router APIs. And so like I don't know if we've talked at all before about how Angular checks the code that we commit against Google's code. So Google has, many thousands of Angular applications, millions of Angular tests. And so when we check in a change to the Angular GitHub, it's already been validated against the applications that run at Google. And there's a whole CI system for doing this. And the way it works is for most changes, we run a subset of the tests that could possibly be affected. And we've selected this subset to kind of balance between the cost in order to run it and the likelihood that it'll detect problems. So we've picked a subset of applications that we think are really representative of how people use Angular. When we make changes to the router, this is one of those times where we say instead of running a subset of all the tests, we commit to running every test at Google that's possibly affected by changing the Angular router.
Oh, is that all?
It is so sensitive to the little things that people do to integrate with routing. So, you know, you make some small change somewhere and it, you know, will break like one test out of several million. Because this test happens to be for an application where like someone extended the router to do something strange, and you know we didn't necessarily know they were doing that to start with. So yeah, it's Andrew does a fantastic job with it, and it is challenging work.
I'm gonna add him to the list. I want to meet him. Anyone that you think is cool has got to be cool.
We should definitely bring Doug on here at some point too.
Doug was here.
Oh, good. Okay.
Doug is cool, but Doug's coming back absolutely because Doug, I've been following Doug on Twitter ever since we met him, and I think he needs to come back because he's talking about some cool stuff. Because he's on the tooling team, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's all kinds of okay. So we're gonna have so much more fun with the Angular team, and Alex, I like, even though we have a lot of other people to talk to, I'm going to keep coming back to you because you're just one of my favorite people. And I really, I can't thank you enough. Do we have to, Rob, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, Iris just answered a question before in regards to the router because they were wondering why we needed to put the component in the app module section. Right, so in order for us to use it, right, anywhere. So, and when we do the router, we don't need to put it there. That was a question as to why, but I said that because we're already importing it. When we're using the router imports the actual component so that you're able to use it as a dependency injection through the router, I guess, right? Or am I wrong about that?
So interesting.
We could go into a whole nother, maybe we should save that one for Andrew because we could go into a whole lot more detail about that.
I'll give you a kind of a short answer to this question. And it's thought-provoking. Nothing in the way the router is designed requires you at all to import the ng module associated with the component when you want to use it as a route. So if I make a component, you know, like admin page component, and I say the route /admin goes to the admin page component in my routing module, I don't have to import the admin page component. I don't have to import its ng module. That will work. It's not supposed to. You're not supposed to do it that way, but the component will be able to render. The problem is, if you do this, you miss out on any configuration for dependency injection that the component needs in order to work. So if the component injects a service and that service is only provided in the component's module, then if you don't import the component's module, that won't actually be able to work. The way this works, right, the fact that you don't need to actually import the component is a quirk of how Ivy works. It was necessary in Vue Engine. In Vue Engine, you had to do things like entry components and stuff for, you know, stuff that you wanted to create dynamically like that. Yeah, so you should import the module because you need to make sure that the component has all of its providers satisfied if it wants to bring some. But it will occasionally work without that.
If you just have a plain Jane component, then you don't need to import it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Technically, you don't need to, right? You still should, because someone might come along later and add dependencies that component then needs this module to work with.
Right.
The really exciting thing here is we have this feature coming down the pipeline called standalone components. And the point of a standalone component is you can reference it directly, and it already has everything it needs to work, and you don't need to bring a module along with it. So in that sense, for a standalone component, you can just say, route to this component, and Angular should be able to take care of the rest.
So exciting.
Thank you.
All right, I'm watching Saunders squirm because Dutch people eat dinner at exactly 6, and he's late for dinner, and his wife is a very good cook. So I know Alex has to get back to work, so we're going to wrap it up here. This was so much fun. And Alex, I just want to thank you as always. I also want to say a quick thank you to AG Grid for helping us keep Angular Nation going and having this cool place for us to have these conversations, because I love it. We're going to have so many more conversations with the Angular team. And Alex Rickabaugh, come back soon and often. We love you. And you guys know the tradition. This is when you come off mute and help me thank our awesome guest.
Can I say a quick word of thank you real quick? Alex, I've been following all of your videos on conferences and everywhere, and I feel like the way you explain topics, even if it's super convoluted and not something that a junior Angular developer would know about, the way you explain it makes it so easy to understand, and I really appreciate that, and thank you for everything that you do.
Oh, thank you very much.
She's right. This is a talent that you have. Not everybody has this talent, Alex. There are some very smart people out there who are not very good teachers. And there are some very smart people out there that make really complicated stuff seem super simple. And we're so grateful that we can ask you all these questions and you just break it down and make it super easy. We love you.
Aw, thank you. That's definitely my dad's fault. I don't know if I mentioned before, but my dad is actually a teacher by training. His business is helping like high schoolers prepare for college and SATs and things like that. So I actually, in my younger days, taught classes with him. And that's where I kind of learned how to like break things down and explain things.
So
So I have him
we thank him also.
Yeah.
So grateful. Yeah.
It's good for us, that's for sure.
Yeah.
All
Well,
right,
thank you
everybody.
so much for having me.
Thank you.
We love
Thank you,
having
Alex.
Yes,
Thank you, Alex.
Alex, and
Really
thanks to Alex
appreciate
for that.
so much.
Thanks, Alex.
See you soon. Bye.
All right,
Cheers.
that's a wrap.
Have a
Thanks,
great
everybody.
afternoon.
See you.
evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.